Okay. Pardon me?
They'll have to see the furniture.
Yeah, do something. Good morning. Yes. The Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations and Related Programs will come to order. I'm pleased to welcome State Department Inspector General, Mr. Steve Linick, and USAID Inspector General, Ms. Ann Calvaresi Barr. The oversight of programs and operations to ensure accountability and effectiveness of taxpayer dollars must be a paramount focus of all government agencies. And I am glad you are here today to provide your assessment of where improvements need to be made at the Department of State and USAID. As chairwoman of both the House Appropriations Committee and this subcommittee, I was pleased to oversee the passage of the FY 2020 House State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill, which would provide more than $56 billion for our diplomatic and development efforts. These programs are not just the... Good morning. These programs are not just the right thing to do, they support our national security and economic growth and help promote democracy abroad. The mandate of Inspectors General is to provide independent oversight that ensures the integrity of our programs and prevents the waste, fraud, and abuse of U.S. taxpayer dollars. Your particular mandate is even more challenging given the high volume of overseas partners and the unpredictable environments in which the State Department and USAID work. The offices of the Inspectors General must have the necessary resources to ensure United States government engagement and investments are efficient and effective, especially in areas affected by conflict, humanitarian crisis, political instability, or terrorism. To this end, our FY 2020 bill would provide $90.8 million to the Department of State's Office of the Inspector General and $75.5 million to USAID's Office of the Inspector General to ensure accountability in program implementation and operations. Ms. Calvaresi Barr, I want to point out that the House provided the level your office requested, not the lesser amount requested by the President. While I support efforts to strengthen civil societies, provide sectors and host country health systems, a push for local procurement can lead to difficult to manage risk, especially in areas of instability or when responding to humanitarian crises. I am also concerned about long-standing management challenges your offices have identified at the State Department and USAID. We must always strive to do better on behalf of the American people. Lastly, I also want to emphasize, especially as we near the 2020 election cycle, that critical attention must be paid to Hatch Act compliance. I expect your offices to refer any reported violations of the Hatch Act to the Office of Special Counsel for Enforcement. Thank you for your commitment to providing independent oversight of our overseas programs today and beyond. We encourage transparent coordination with Congress in identifying challenges at the State Department and USAID. Your insight and recommendations on solutions are most welcome. Before we hear your testimony, let me turn to my ranking member, Mr. Rogers for any opening remarks he would like to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I join the distinguished chairwoman in welcoming our witnesses back to the subcommittee. As you may recall, the first hearing I held as chairman of this subcommittee was with these two inspectors general, examining critical areas of oversight for the Department of State and USAID. I look forward to receiving your update today on challenges that continue to hamper the efficiency and effectiveness of the agencies that you oversee, as well as progress that's been made since we last met. I would also like to thank the two of you and your colleagues for your continued service to the country. You're doing good work, and this committee values the objective and rigorous oversight that you conduct on behalf of the American taxpayer. We rely on your expertise to help us kick the tires and look under the hood of the department. What we have found are chronic mismanagement challenges. Some are being addressed sufficiently, others are not. We need to shine a light on these problems and ensure that top leadership of the agencies are acting on your recommendations. I've been taken aback, frankly, during my time on this subcommittee to see the same set of top challenges identified year after year. Simply put, it's not acceptable. So I want to hear from you today both on what specific things need to be done to remedy this management shortfall. Mr. Linick, this year you identified 7 key management and performance challenges at Department of State. They will sound familiar to anyone following your work, and they include these: protection of people and facilities, oversight of contracts, grants, and foreign assistance, information security management, financial and property management, operating in contingency and critical environments, workforce management, and promoting accountability through internal coordination and clear lines of authority. Now that we finally have an Undersecretary of Management in place, a fight that we've been fighting, seems like forever. Finally, an Undersecretary of Management in place. Hallelujah. We will be watching to see how he plans to address these challenges I just mentioned that cut across the most important and fundamental responsibilities of the department. Ms. Barr, this year you identified 4 top management challenges, including managing risks inherent in providing humanitarian and stabilization assistance, strengthening local capacity and improving program planning and monitoring, reconciling interagency priorities and functions to more efficiently and effectively advance U.S. foreign assistance, and addressing vulnerabilities in financial and information management. I raise these issues, most of which are not new, with Administrator Green during our USAID oversight hearing early this year. He committed to completing the recommendations that I just mentioned, so I intend to follow up on that and would appreciate your most recent assessment of their work on this. We want to see results, finally. There's no shortage of topics to discuss, so in closing, Madam Chairwoman, I want to thank these 2 witnesses and their staffs, as well as your staff stationed around the world, for leading the fight against waste, fraud, and abuse. We appreciate your continued and meaningful engagement with this subcommittee. I yield back.
Ms. Calvaresi Barr and Mr. Linick, if you would be kind enough to summarize your oral statement, we will be happy to place your full testimonies and recommendations into the record. After your testimony, I will call on members based on seniority present when the hearing was called to order. I will alternate between majority and minority. Each member is asked to keep their questions to 5 minutes per round. Ms. Calvaresi Barr, please proceed.
Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for your invitation to testify today. USAID frequently relies on other entities to implement its programs, particularly in tough environments. It must continually balance the imperative to deliver on its mission against the risks associated with it. This context demands flexibilities, but creates risks. To better ensure USAID effectively manages these risks, we shifted our oversight model from a country-specific one to one that is more strategic and cross-cutting. This has put us in a strong position to make recommendations that get at the root of USAID's most persistent challenges. Our impact is encapsulated in 4 top management challenges for fiscal year 19. The first challenge concerns managing humanitarian assistance threats. Insufficient risk assessments not only leave USAID assistance vulnerable to exploitation, but exposes the agency to threats it does not fully understand. This allowed bad actors to profit from U.S. goodwill and in some cases to materially support terrorists. We've uncovered fraud, corruption, and mismanagement in cross-border relief programs in Syria, stabilization efforts in Iraq, and public health response efforts in Africa. The second challenge concerns the sustainability of some of USAID's largest development investments. We found a lack of upfront analyses that fully assess countries' capacity, will, and resources long after U.S. involvement ends. Insufficient planning and monitoring underlies this all and further diminishes sustainability. Reconciling interagency priorities to advance foreign assistance is the third challenge. Coordination and consensus are key to keeping interagency programs on track. Competing priorities impede development activities. The fourth challenge concerns the integrity of USAID's financial and information management systems. It all starts here. Without reliable core systems, the agency cannot successfully execute its mission. Our work has prompted foundational changes at USAID. They, for example, set strict requirements on implementer awards, strengthened standards for overseeing UN agencies, shored up its supply chain for life-saving commodities, and promptly responded to identified diversions to terrorist organizations. It has also doubled down on requirements for reporting sexual exploitation and abuse of beneficiaries. While positive actions, the agency needs to rethink its culture of partnership with implementers. No doubt, they are critical to USAID's mission, but it must first ensure implementers fully understand the requirements that they are entrusted with and expected to carry out. Ultimately, USAID must be the first line of defense, but they must also hold others they rely on accountable. This concludes my prepared statement. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Chairwoman Lowy, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify regarding the work of the Office of Inspector General. We appreciate your interest in our work. We oversee the operations and programs of the Department of State and the U.S. Agency for Global Media, also known as USAGM, which include more than 75,000 employees and 270 overseas missions and domestic entities. In fiscal year 2018 alone, we were responsible for the oversight of more than $70 billion in Department and USAGM programs and operations. I'd like to highlight some of our recent work. One of our top priorities is protecting those who work for the Department around the world. We continue to find critical vulnerabilities that put our people at risk. We have reported on facilities maintenance deficiencies at overseas posts, weaknesses in emergency preparedness, and health and safety concerns related to residential housing. We've also reported on the management of specific construction contracts, where poor oversight led to physical deficiencies, some with safety and security concerns for new buildings. We've also focused on the Department's management of contracts, grants, and foreign assistance. This is a continuing challenge for the Department that involves substantial resources. In fiscal year 2018 alone, the Department's obligations were more than $30 billion. Nearly 40% of the investigations we closed in fiscal year 2018 were related to contract and grant fraud. And we've issued several recent reports that highlighted problems such as ineffective performance monitoring of contractors, deficient invoice reviews and approval processes, and insufficient program evaluation. Our annual FSMA report identified numerous control weaknesses that significantly affected program effectiveness and increased the Department's vulnerability to cyber attack and threat. We continue to assess the Department's workforce management challenges. We found that across functional and geographic regions, inexperienced staff, insufficient training, staffing gaps, and frequent turnover negatively affect Department programs and operations. During my tenure at the Office of Inspector General, we have undertaken many initiatives to improve how we use our limited resources to further our oversight mission. Most recently, we began posting monthly reports on unclassified recommendations on our public website. We provide this information as well as monthly reports on classified recommendations to the Department and to Congress. Before closing, I would like to note that we recently observed improvements as a result of our work. The Department is doing a better job of tracking physical security deficiencies, its upgraded management of its contract file inventory, and its improved armored vehicle programs in multiple ways. I've included financial information in my written testimony that demonstrates the ways that OIG helps return money to the American public. We are also proud of our work relating to the safeguarding of the lives of those at posts abroad and protecting the Department's information, reputation, and program integrity. I want to thank you all again for your interest in and support of our work, and I want to emphasize that OIG's accomplishments are really a credit to the talented and committed staff that I've had the privilege to lead over the last 5 years. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I'd like to begin with a request from my colleagues, Chairman Engel and Chairman Cummings, from the Foreign Affairs and Oversight Committees, respectively. They suggested, and in fact, they asked me to follow up on their request. They asked you to conduct an inquiry into reports that career employees at the State Department had been subjected to improper retaliation, including for their perceived political views and ethnic identity. I understand that your office has been carrying out that inquiry for well over a year now, and it is critical that facts about any prohibited personnel practices at the department be brought to light so that perpetrators can be held to account and future retaliation can be deterred. Mr. Linick, do you believe prohibited personnel practices were carried out against any of the State Department employees about whom my colleagues have raised concerns?
Well, thank you for that question. We actually have ongoing work addressing that very issue. We have 2 reports. We are looking at allegations of improper personnel practices in the Office of the Secretary, and we are looking at improper personnel practices in the Office of International Relations. The Office of International Relations organizations, that report will be going to the Department in the next day or 2. And the report involving the Office of the Secretary, I anticipate, will be going to the Department in August. So that very issue that you've just raised is part of our report, and I'm not prepared to report on the findings, but I'm confident that those findings will be published shortly after these reports are finished.
I appreciate that, but I wonder if you can share with us, in the context of the investigation, has the department taken any steps to address these allegations? You say you're doing a report, but have there been any steps specifically taken to deter further retaliation?
I can't comment on any of that until my report's published. I mean, we address those issues in the reports, and I'm reluctant to talk about our findings until we have a final report.
Well, I was also told that you've decided to delay releasing a piece of the report dealing with allegations against members of the Secretary's own senior staff. Is that correct?
That's not correct. We started with one report involving allegations against individuals and international organizations, and also allegations against the Secretary's office. We decided to split the reports up because we're basically done with the international organizations report. We wanted to get that out to the department and get that published after the department has a chance to look at it. The other report, the allegations involving the Office of the Secretary, like I said, which I anticipate will be going to the department in August, that's more complex. There's a parallel OSC investigation, and we want to make sure we get it right. We want it to be accurate and thorough. It's a top priority for our office, and I'm confident that once it's published, you will see that it's accurate, thorough, and complete.
Now, one last question, because we've seen documents indicating that some department officials use their personal rather than their government email accounts to discuss employees' political views and background. Did you seek these relevant records from both personnel and government email accounts? Is that a valid concern?
I can say that where appropriate, we did actually collect private email as well.
Thank you. Now, one of my concerns for many years has been the protection of people and facilities. And I know it's always been a top management challenge to the State Department. You've identified systemic issues regarding physical security, specifically a lack of coordination between the Bureau of Overseas Building Operations and the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, both of which have responsibility for physical security. So I'm, as you know, very concerned about these issues. Have these two bureaus implemented your office's recommendations to address physical security-related deficiencies?
So the relationship between Office of Diplomatic Security, Bureau of Diplomatic Security, DS, and OBO has improved in terms of coordination. I would say the most significant recommendation that has not been implemented, which we believe would go far in addressing security concerns, has to do with prioritizing physical security deficiencies around the world. So in other words, the department has a universe of physical deficiencies, and they're prioritized based on risk, and then they can use their limited resource to figure out how they're going to aim their resources for purposes of planning in the future. I think it would also give them a way to be more proactive as opposed to reactive when security deficiencies come up.
Can you just comment, or either, first I'll start with Mr. Linick, on the hiring freeze, and did it damage state and USAID's ability to meet diplomatic challenges and effectively manage foreign assistance programs around the world?
So we have a report that's in its final stages on that very issue, on the impact of the hiring freeze. I believe you asked us to do that work, and we've looked at the impact of the hiring freeze both in 2017 and its impact currently. And so that report will be published soon, so I can't really talk about the findings of that particular report. However, I can share with you anecdotal evidence from our inspections in which we've gathered information during our overseas work about the hiring freeze, and I can say that there is evidence that it has affected staffing, for example, in consular operations. It's affected staffing in Bureau of Diplomatic Security, which obviously affects our security if we have limited staff. It's affected our IT staff. And it's had a big impact on our eligible family members and our civil service. And as I understand it, we have not recovered yet, even with our civil service staffing levels at this point.
Now, specifically, has your office evaluated the continuing lack of senior leadership at state and its impact on policy formation and program execution? Can you just share with us briefly your findings on that?
Absolutely. We haven't done a sort of a systematic look at the impact of vacancies at the senior levels, so we don't have a report or a body of work in one place on that. However, as I mentioned before, we do inspections all over the world. We look at executive direction and leadership, and I would say the results are mixed. In the spring, we did 13 inspections, and 5 of which were posts without ambassadors. And in some instances where we don't have leadership, we have found that it has affected the morale. It's affected foreign relationships with the host government. We had one situation where a particular chargé, an acting ambassador, could not meet with the foreign minister because of the and it's also impacted strategic planning. What complicates things is when these vacancies are filled by folks who are very well-intentioned, but who are wearing dual hats, who are, perhaps management officers who are doing the work of DCMs and things.
Respond, or they say, okay, it's fine that it's not operating effectively?
Well, as to the first issue, we actually write our findings in a report. All of this is public.
Who gets it?
Congress, the American public, and the Department, Secretary of State.
Anybody in the White House that you all respond to? The Secretary of State should be concerned about this, no?
We don't report to the White House. We report to Congress and to the Secretary of State, and
You do report to the Secretary of State?
we do, by law.
Has there been any feedback?
Well, we get feedback on our findings. The department comments on them. Sometimes they do take action. Sometimes they've removed leaders in those spots, and they're aware of, and we get frequent feedback from the department on our findings.
Well, I'm going to turn to Mr. Rogers, but if we have time, I'd like to explore that further. If you are doing a careful analysis and you're getting feedback from the field, specifically the kind of incidents you spoke about, and you don't get any concern or any direct change, it seems to me we have a real problem here. Mr. Rogers.
It's long been the focus, Mr. Linick, in your office on the oversight of contracts, grants, and foreign assistance. As the department engages in very complex acquisitions to procure services and supplies, the department continues to contractor performance. Oversight personnel must monitor and document performance, confirm that work is conducted in accordance with the terms of a contract, hold contractors accountable for non-performance, and ensure that costs are effectively described in your most recent top management report. Our inexperienced, untrained oversight personnel, staff rotations that promote inefficiency, and complex programs and contracts that simply require more oversight.
That is correct. The department, this has been a persistent issue with the department for many years. At the root of it, I think it's a cultural issue. They're not really focused on program management, they're focused on diplomacy, and there's far too much program and far too little oversight. And this results in a lack of sustained focus on experienced staff and getting contracting personnel properly trained up. There are structural issues in the department as well. We have a mix of people who are doing contract oversight, including foreign service officers, who are moving from post to post, so there's lack of consistency in contract oversight. One of the biggest recommendations in this area that we've made is the department needs an electronic inventory system so that our contracting officer representatives who are in far-flung places can be overseen by contracting officers at headquarters in Washington, and that still hasn't happened. At the root of this, in my estimation, is they really need to professionalize the contracting personnel at the State Department. There needs to be a job series for contracting officers, contracting officer representatives, and the like. So it is a problem, and I think that improvements are at the margins.
Would you do a paper for us on that topic that you just covered? Can you prepare for us a summary of the problem that we're discussing here and what we can do to fix it?
I would be happy to work with your staff in coming up with a scope of a paper like that. That would be fine.
I thank you for that.
Yep.
We look forward to hearing from you. Now, the President's budget request for the department and in fact in your office suggest quite a substantial cut in your funding levels. What do you say about that?
Well, we requested $90.8 million, which is what our budget was last year, and we received $88.8 million. So we had a $2 million decrease. We need resources. We have worldwide coverage. We have huge travel costs. We have mandatory inspections that we have to do all over the world. We have whistleblower obligations and reporting requirements. We have many requests from Congress to do work, and everybody wants their work done quickly. And we also have our own separate IT network, and we need money for that. So we asked for money for that. We're independent from the department. We became independent just a few years ago. So we need the resources.
If later this year the administration acts on their proposal to draw down State Department and AID personnel in Afghanistan, with parallel reductions in U.S. civilian assistance, how would that impact your ongoing oversight mission?
Well, we think that there's even more risk with a drawdown. We've done work on this in the past, more risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. We've done work on this in the past when there was a drawdown back in 2013 in Iraq, and we found that the drawdown of personnel was not done in accordance with guidelines and so forth, and we found $193 million in waste. So I would argue that oversight is even more critical if there is a drawdown, and we are insisting that we continue to maintain our current staff both in Afghanistan and Iraq for that purpose, and to the extent that there is a drawdown, we do plan on auditing that, given the history of issues that we've seen in the past.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Just a quick comment before I turn to Mr. Price. We've been in Afghanistan 17 years, is that correct?
Sounds about right.
It doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out that if you suddenly withdraw, there would be problems. And we've recently read of girls' schools being blown up. So I just wonder who's listening to you with regard to drawdown. Is your input taken seriously by the Secretary of State, or are they just going about their business?
Well, I can tell you that I've talked about this issue of drawdown and the perils of a quick drawdown without a systematic look with both the Deputy Secretary of State, the Undersecretary for Management, and I've actually sent letters to the U.S. Ambassador in Afghanistan, John Bass, and I've also sent a letter to the Chargé, Joey Hood, in Iraq, warning them of the dangers, at least from a fraud, waste, abuse perspective, of a drawdown that doesn't take into consideration cost optimization, foreign policy priorities, and so forth.
Have you gotten any response?
They've acknowledged receipt of the information, and they appear to understand the implications.
Has there been any change in the plans as a result of your thoughtful presentation?
I don't know. I haven't looked at it, so it would be unfair for me to say yes or no, but I haven't
Why
looked.
wouldn't you look at it?
Well,
I would think that you have an incredibly important responsibility. And if you can document specific problems with the drawdown that is being proposed, I would think you have a responsibility to scream from the rafters to the Secretary of State or to whomever is listening.
Well, we do plan on looking at the drawdown. What we don't want to do is get involved.
Just looking at the drawdown.
OIG, state OIG will be looking at the drawdown once it's done. In other words, we will be auditing it. We've
Oh, please. So if you are presenting information delineating the risks of specific drawdowns, you're going to wait until after it's done and you're going to assess the damage? I'm puzzled by that.
Well, first of all, we haven't seen any plans for drawdown, number one, and we don't want to get involved in the policy issues. We've warned the department that a drawdown needs to be done carefully to avoid fraud, waste, and abuse. So they understand, we provided them with our past work on this, so we have a track record. So everybody sort of knows, what's at stake here. At the end of the day, we can't get involved in the drawdown and say you can't do this or you can't do that, because that would be beyond our role as an Office of Inspector General. But I believe that we have acted responsibly by being very proactive in trying to prevent the fraud before it occurs.
Before I turn to Mr. Price, I would like to personally, and I certainly would want to share it with this committee, your memos regarding concerns about drawdowns.
Absolutely.
And any response that you've gotten from the Secretary of State, or non-response that you've gotten from the Secretary.
We'd be happy to provide them.
Because for those of us who've been to Afghanistan and been very involved, this is problematic, which is the understatement. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to turn to Ms. Calvaresi Barr with a related question, which has to do with the unusually wide gap that's opened up in this administration between congressional intent, as expressed in the appropriation of funds, and what's actually carried out on the ground. And I do have some general I do have some curiosity about the extent to which that represents a red flag for you, and would call forth some analysis when we're talking about funds being just cut off in the middle of the year, or for that matter, reports about funds moving out very slowly and in ways that really frustrate congressional intent. But let me turn directly to the cutoffs. These cutoffs, let's just focus on the West Bank Gaza cutoff and the Triangle countries of of Central America cutoff. Let's just focus on those. Ostensibly, these cutoffs of funds in the middle of the fiscal year are linked to foreign assistance reviews, very broad reviews, not about specific programs, but about whole countries. And they've been accompanied with rhetoric that suggests a punitive intent. The Central American countries aren't doing enough to stop the flow of migrants, and so we cut off the funds designed to help them prevent the flow of migrants. I'm not saying it makes sense. I'm just saying it suggests a punitive intent. Same with the Palestinian aid. These people supposedly aren't cooperating satisfactorily in a process that has totally marginalized them. So there's a punitive intent that's suggested. There's this ostensible tie to a review. I want to ask you about that. There was a review, as I understand, the Trump administration undertook a review of assistance to South Sudan, but the funding continued during that review. And I wonder what the normal practice is. First of all, how narrowly focused these reviews normally are, and if they usually involve a total cutoff of funds. And then I want to, if we have time, want to get into the question of what does this kind of abrupt cutoff do to the way these programs work or don't work on the ground. But if you could answer me about the cutoffs and the ostensible link to reviews, and what your office what your office has to say about this, to the extent to which you have looked at it or would intend to.
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. And, I will start by saying that policy decisions that are made, as Steve indicated, are something that the IG comes at from an oversight perspective, and we stay clear of commenting on sort of policy decisions. But what we need to do as an IG, as an effective independent IG, is to look at the effect of those decisions, the effect of those drawdowns. I'm going to start with where you ended on your question, which is...
Before you do that, I do want you to talk about that, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But, and I don't expect you to comment on my comments about the rhetorical, overlay here. But the process is a legitimate question, and I'm asking you about the process and what the normal process is, and the ostensible tying of a total cutoff across a whole region or across a whole country to some kind of broad review. I mean, what's the process here?
So decisions are oftentimes made. Sometimes these decisions are made and they take the diplomats overseas and other mission folks overseas by surprise. As we saw, Steve and I, along with the DoD IG, travel into theater quite a bit. And our lead IG construct, and when we met with diplomats as well as senior career folks, both at state, DoD, and USAID, you could see that they were struggling to figure out how to adjust to the cuts that were coming in. In the case of USAID, I have seen the impact that it has on the implementer community. USAID relies on implementers oftentimes to do its work, particularly in those tough environments. And that type of one day we're on, one day we're off creates very chaotic operations in terms of what are we supposed to do next. So what you see happen on the ground is you see, whether it be state, DoD, or USAID, looking at what the directive is, what the cut is, and coming up with scenarios about how they will manage to that. On your questions with regard to West Bank, Gaza, the Northern Triangle countries, and South Sudan, we have ongoing work in those areas. In West Bank and Gaza, obviously, key consideration is all the money that goes into conflict mitigation, risk mitigation, peacekeeping kind of efforts, and we've looked at over 100 grants there that were in place for that. That program will be affected by decisions about funding cuts. Our job, and we are looking at what is the impact of those decisions on those programs. My opening statement, I talked about the importance of, and the administrator talks about the importance of, getting to a point where there's an end for the need for foreign assistance. So what that means is there has to be consistency, there has to be sustainability, there has to be local capacity built up. If program decisions go on ebb and flow, it really impedes the ability to get to that sustainable end for a need for foreign assistance. So we are on it. We are looking at the close down of West Bank, Gaza funding, looking at that process there. For the Northern Triangle countries, we have staff in San Salvador. We have been very, very concerned with the CARSI initiative, which is the security initiative, given the flow, migration, and the real security risks that work there. We're looking at the impact of those programs on what that means for that entire region. We're also very, very concerned about the program money getting into nefarious hands. Therefore, we have many of our agents out conducting fraud awareness briefings, trying to identify where the money is going, and making sure, to many of the points made earlier, that there are strong procurement, strong award protections in money that flows. At USAID alone, $71 billion goes into awards per year. We've got to get this right. So the final point that I would make is that oftentimes, while there is a cut in funding or there's proposals for cuts in fundings, some of these programs have long pipelines. They have money that are still in them and that the programs will continue to go on. That's why we keep our eye in that area. Those funding cuts doesn't mean OIG out. It means OIG in even more. So we're on the programs in those regions. We're going to look at the effect of any type of drawdown. We'll look at the pipeline of funds and hope to assess, have we lost the ground that our good investment up to this point has provided? And it goes to my top management challenge about sustainability.
Thank you. I think what we've heard is very important, Madam Chairman, about the kind of analysis that needs to be done, of course, of these programs' effectiveness in general, but the effects of draconian cuts of the sort that have been made. You know, just in the middle of the fiscal year, all the money stops. And of course, it doesn't immediately stop on the ground, but our understanding is that it's pretty well having a detrimental effect now in both the Central American situation and the and the West Bank Gaza situation. I think we've discovered on this committee that we don't have perhaps as many options as we thought we did when this kind of cut comes down in the middle of the fiscal year. The chairwoman, to her credit, has written our bills for next year in a much tighter way, in a way that will not permit the administration to be as fast and loose with this funding as they have been. But in the near term, not so clear. Not so clear what our options are. But your assessment is extremely important to us at this moment as we contemplate this and also go forward.
And I know this issue is of great concern to members on both sides, and so we will continue the discussion. Ms. Roby.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both for being here. And Inspector General Calvaresi Barr, I'm going to read directly from your testimony before I get to my question.
Sure.
Our work continues to show that USAID's upfront analysis of multi-million-dollar projects falls short of fully assessing beneficiary countries' internal controls, environmental threats, and ability to strengthen local skills and secure public or private sector commitment to sustain U.S. efforts. In addition, we identified gaps in USAID's ongoing monitoring and evaluation that limit its ability to apply past lessons to better ensure sustainability of future development efforts. To the chairwoman's comments earlier about Afghanistan, I've had the privilege of going with my colleague Susan Davis from California on a bipartisan women's CODEL now 8 times around Mother's Day. What's unique about this CODEL is not only do we spend time with our troops and encourage them and be with them and hear about their challenges, but also what's unique about this CODEL is that we get to spend a lot of time with Afghan women and folks from USAID that are administering programs. My concern is that the purpose of the initiative, which has been in place since 2014 to promote women in the Afghan economy, to provide a new generation of Afghan women with leadership skills to make contributions to their government, society, and economy. And I enthusiastically support the mission of these programs. But what I'm concerned about is the metrics by which we are assessing the success of these programs. So it's one thing to say, Madam Chairwoman, that we've enrolled X number of women in school. It's another thing to say, okay, well, where are they now? How are they contributing to the Afghan economy? What are the reasons that if we have a job placement program and these women are able to either work in security forces and be trained effectively, or have a job, a small business, startup, whatever it may be, if they are removed from the workforce, what are the reasons why? If an Afghan girl is in a school and she's given the opportunity for an education, what happens to her next? And do we have the appropriate metrics in place? And I don't know that we do, to assess the contributions and the success of these women, or the instances in which they were unable to continue either in their education efforts or in their support of the economy. So if you would address that, I know that's a very specific question to Afghanistan. I think you could apply it around the world, although the challenges are different based on what country we're talking about. But I have real concerns as a member of this committee is how we're assessing outcomes as opposed to just enrollment. If that's a real simplification, I understand, but if you could address that for me, I would really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying that our office has covered the waterfront on work from both an audit perspective and an investigations perspective in Afghanistan. If I could start just by saying a little bit about, about that. We have looked at, and it gets to the heart of your question about metrics, monitoring and evaluation, whether it was on the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, whether it's on the new development partnership work that they have, that you have to prove that you've done what you've done in order to receive funding for program sustainability going forward. And we continue to look at that. We found significant deficiencies in the ability to measure, the ability to monitor, and really show the types of outcomes that you're talking about that should be achieved. On the investigation side of the house in Afghanistan, these are challenging environments to work in, and the programming does cut across the gamut, right, of what populations like this are in need of. I can tell you our investigations work in Afghanistan has uncovered corruption and fraud to such a great scale. Just in the public utility power industry, our work resulted in the removal of the Ministry of Economy and the CEO of that public utility company. Our work on AUAF with the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction has pointed to weak systems to be a good recipient of U.S. taxpayer money, which has been invested for a long time there, resulted in an administrative agreement to make sure AUAF gets its house in order. With all of that said, we look at those programs, we look at other programs regarding health, education, women's empowerment, going forward. And I think you're right when you say, and we read this in the press oftentimes, and we find it in our reports when we do it, when they talk about success, there could be disagreements on the measure, how successful or how bad, and we sort of see it all over the map. So it definitely goes to the heart of needing to have, for these programs right up front, what's important, what is the goal of the program, what is it that we're trying to measure. If these programs are about building capacity and sustainability, we don't just look at the number of women that were educated, we go beyond that. We look at how has that resulted in a different state of living for them, job opportunities for them, security, a whole range of things, and we found that those metrics are often missing. The administrator has, I want to get this point in, has recognized the importance of metrics. He's very metrics driven, and you're seeing now in many of the programs that are being rolled out on his journey to self-reliance, he wants to make sure that those metrics are established correctly in the first place.
And I appreciate that. And Madam Chair, if I may, I would appreciate any detailed information that you can provide specific to programs for Afghan women and girls. And I want to see the good, the bad, and the ugly. Anything specific that you can drill down there for me, I would appreciate that. But Madam Chairwoman, I would just say I express your concerns on an abrupt drawdown, and I think part of what we're hearing right now is the ability to assess a lot of these dollars that are being spent on behalf of Afghan women and girls has to do with the security situation and our ability to get to certain parts of the country where it's volatile. We have made tremendous gains, but it is extraordinarily fragile. And so it is very important that as these dollars are being implemented, that this committee takes a keen interest on these metrics and the success, not just of who's being enrolled and how many are being enrolled, but the following those women and those girls throughout their contribution to the country. So I thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on
Thank you, and I
this.
look forward to working with you and following up. Thank you. Ms. Meng.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Rogers, for holding this hearing. I wanted to ask Mr. Linick a question. Just yesterday, our subcommittee held a hearing in which one of the witnesses was John Lansing, CEO of USAGM, who testified. The purpose of Voice of America and other USAGM programming is to provide those who live under corrupt and non-democratic regimes access to unbiased and accurate reporting. These programs are critical to our soft power all around the world, but have a very important role to play in restricted countries like Russia, Iran, and Cuba. USAGM has proven to be riddled with corruption and grift. A New York Times article just on Monday reported that a high-ranking advisor had been found guilty of stealing $37,000. The same report noted that reporters have accepted bribes from foreign officials and have faked news stories. This undermines the whole purpose of USAGM. I wanted to know if your office will be investigating these issues. Have you looked into them? And what underlying management concerns do you think exist in USAGM that might contribute to such negligence?
Thank you for the question. The individual you mentioned who stole $37,000, that was our investigation. That was an OIG investigation. And we presented it to DOJ, who ultimately prosecuted that individual, the chief strategy officer. Our oversight of, we oversee USAGM, and through that, the federal entities who receive money, as well as the grantees, as well as the language services. So we are involved in overseeing USAGM in a very broad sense. We oversee them through inspections, through investigations, through audits. On USAGM, we have focused on governance and resource management, as well as misconduct, as I previously indicated. And with respect to USAGM, since that was the focus of your question, in terms of resource management, we have found a lot of issues over the years in our management challenges. We've identified IT has been ineffective, their information system. They have deficiencies in all the major domains that we look at. We've found problems with property and accounting and hiring practices. So they span the gamut of issues. I will say on the governance front, though, we did a report in 2014 or 2014 where we looked at the board. We found that the then structure was dysfunctional. It was a part-time board. At the time, there were chronic vacancies. There was no CEO managing day-to-day operations. And there were perceptions of favoritism because folks who were on the board were also sitting on some of the grantees boards, and then there was a perception that they were steering, their favorite grants to the grantees. Since then, we made a number of recommendations. We recommended that there be a full-time CEO managing day-to-day operations. There's been a law that's since passed for a presidentially appointed CEO and an advisory board. We did assess that recently, and we did find that they're on the right track in terms of governance. We found that the board was cohesive and collaborative, that they've eliminated the perceptions of favoritism because all the board members now sit on all of the grantees, so they weren't cherry picking. We found there was increased use of digitization and media, social media, YouTube, things like that, and that the editorial independence of the grantees and the federal entities were being respected. So that's sort of you know, a big, an overview of our work over the last 5-6 years.
Thank you. I appreciate all that information. I just ask that your office stay on top of this. Yesterday, when we asked him, he didn't, to my memory, mention any of this. He mentioned reshifting or improvement in personnel allocations, for example, but didn't really mention IT, accounting, or even board issues specifically. So would look forward to continuing to look into this. My second question, if I have some extra time, is for Inspector General Calvaresi Barr. Over the last 2 years, your office has investigated failures in a contract administered by USAID and implemented by Chemonics. This contract, as you know, was intended to support the global health supply chain, is worth $9.5 billion, and was the largest contract ever awarded by USAID. And according to an October 2018 advisory published by your office, this contract experienced major delays in the delivery of health commodities and was exposed to vulnerabilities related to commodity tracking, supply chain, data access, reporting, commodity inventory access labeling, and other issues. At the time of the memo's publication, your office was encouraged by increased engagement between the Bureau and Chemonics. So wanted to find out what types of safeguards might be in place to ensure that this doesn't happen again. Do you believe that the aggressive oversight required over contracts of this size is possible?
Yes, thank you for that question. This is a very, very large contract at $9.5 billion and being an IQ at that. Let me begin by pointing to some of the risks that we found in that realm of that contract and the work, which is on the global health supply chain in Africa. There, we have uncovered a number of risks with regard to the logistics, as we know, that's happening with those commodities in Africa, the storage, the facilities of those, the record keeping of those. Our work has resulted in, as a result of weaknesses in the global health supply chain, has resulted in 41 arrests, 30 indictments, and has prompted the Global Health Bureau to have a third-party monitor overseeing the programming for health supply commodities within Africa. Our work spanned 8 countries. So that raised an eyebrow, right? The investigations work points to the effect of something gone wrong. That's the effect. Now my office is engaged in trying to figure out, why is that happening? What are the root causes of it? So you may be pleased to hear that we're doing 2 audits going forward. One is we are looking back at the contract and how it was awarded. So that's the first audit. The second audit that we're doing is because of those weaknesses that we've uncovered in the supply chain, we are following up to look at how have those weaknesses been addressed, what's being done different from USAID's perspective in terms of its oversight of the contract and that work. But we also have to look to, and it gets to an issue we discussed earlier about capacity of some of these host countries. So I don't want to point the picture that all these problems that we found necessarily lie with Chemonics, but when you're transferring funds and supplies that are very, very needy and very valuable, particularly in third world countries, you need to make sure that the host government has the capacity to receive them, to do their own inventory controls, has strong internal controls. So when we look at this and we dissect this, we're going to look at the contract and how it was awarded, because we too have concerns about award management at USAID, and we're going to peel that onion back. But secondly, we're going to look at the weaknesses that we found through our investigations, which are, 8 countries, and again, those numbers are 41 arrests, 30 indictments, and there's more that go on as a result of that. We're going to look at how well those weaknesses are being addressed in terms of local capacity, the implementer's responsibility as well as USAID's effectiveness at overseeing those.
Your report, and thank you for addressing the issue. Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your willingness to hold this important hearing, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to make some broad comments that can apply, have multiple levels of application. I hope my colleagues will agree. I think these hearings really ought to start with some type of schematic, map, diagram of your overall authorities drilled down into agency and programmatic levels. Now, at USAID and state, that might fill this wall over here, but it will make it take these important discussions, but can tend to be abstract or so narrow that they are not generalizable to the bigger principles that we ultimately have to legislate around, which are policy perspectives, mission ideals. And in that regard, I want to ask you, Ms. Barr, regarding two questions. Regarding the reform plans that are underway at USAID, one particular point is this, that there is an attempt to implement a new risk management approach that will look at the most significant impact, what programs have the most significant impact. In other words, how well foreign assistance actually works under certain scenarios. What are the templates? That, to me, is the most important question here. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I want to turn to the migration of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation to the new International Development Finance Corporation and hear your perspective on how that's going. With particularly one question, and I think, Madam Chair, at an earlier hearing, you tasked me with this, and I think it's very important. The equity investment question that is developing at the International Finance Development Corporation. How we are going to leverage our limited funds potentially into equity investments with private sector partner to achieve the very goals of the earlier OPIC mission in a more substantial way.
Okay.
Are you familiar with what I'm talking about there?
I am.
Okay, good.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let me begin with sort of enterprise risk management and the importance of that. And it has a couple of different legs to that stool, right? So when you think about risk management, you have to think about when you're investing in these countries, and for the most part where USAID space is, we're going to be investing in countries that we know might not have the strongest foundation from a financial, internal control, procurement, or legal perspective.
So we tend to measure outcomes by how much money we've spent and what our intention is. Mm-hmm. I recognize what you're saying, that the risk factors are compounded given the nature of certain
Yes.
weaknesses of systems in other places. It's the very point of the assistance in the first place. So we have to tolerate in a non-traditional sense, a different type of risk profile. But what the question is, what really works and is sustainable over the long term?
Mm-hmm. So I think
and then can be lifted as a template elsewhere.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to keep giving you speeches, but the reality is we direct country by country different types of things, and so the job is made all the harder to find a standardization of template that actually works, but I think that ought to be the goal.
Yeah. So again, starting with the point of recognizing the environment that you're working in, you have to factor that in when you're talking about, so what are we getting out of this, right? You have to factor in, these are the problems, and you have to plan accordingly. What are the risks and mitigate those? That's what the administrator is focusing on now. Where there are successful models, and if I can sort of segue to your second question on, on OPIC and the DFC going forward, I think there is a general recognition, and it's part of the USAID's look forward, that leveraging private capital for foreign assistance is something that needs to be done and needs to be part of the equation. Not just the U.S. coming in, putting money in, because that we oftentimes find, and our work has found, as soon as we leave, then what happens? Long afterwards, those investments go down.
If I could interrupt you right quick, I think we really need to be careful with our language. Foreign capital investments. That implies that has certain implications to it that sound very remote from the poorest of the poor, and yet it's not if we talk in the right types of language, that using the mechanisms of lending and capital, even on a micro scale, actually can be very empowering to people who are in very vulnerable circumstances and lend itself to long-term sustainability versus just writing a check year after year. So I'm just giving a little note of caution because the language of Western liberal economics, in speaking of these abstract ideas of capital, don't necessarily relate to the mission structure of what we're trying to do through USAID to help persons in very vulnerable circumstances. So there's a task here, and this is way beyond you, but you've got me talking now. There's a task here to update vocabulary as well when we talk in terms of both the implementation as well as the review of this. So just a little note of caution.
Okay, no, that's fine. And I was referring to the DFC and the establishment of the DFC as a way to sort of make us a player in that global platform, to leverage that capital for these organizations going forward. Let me get to that specifically because I know that you are interested in that. We have done 2 audits now with regard to OPIC as it stands now. We looked at OPIC's goals and successes in producing energy in that sector in Chile. As a result of that, we found that there were problems with its, not only in the policies and the processes, but they weren't reaching the end goals that they had hoped to through that programming. Our auditors then said, why is that? What's getting in the way? Why aren't they doing this in Chile? As a result of our deeper dive into it, we found systemic issues with OPIC's internal controls. And if you look at what the FAR calls for, some of the most basic things were not in place. We had a number of recommendations, I think 13 to be exact. 2 have been closed so far, so we have a ways to go. We just released a report actually today where, at the request of this committee, looked at OPIC's compliance with appropriations requirements. And that report essentially found the same thing that we noted in the Chile look, which is that the internal controls need to be fixed. And if I might say, before we go to the DFC model, those are issues that should be worked on now before the transition occurs.
Okay, so that's helpful, but I think it needs to lend itself again to the sense of mission of what we're trying to do here with the Development Finance Corporation in terms of a new mechanism of leveraging monies that are out there that actually will create the outcomes we're achieving potentially with less cost and better penetration and better continuity for the long term. So I'm asking you to do something that may be beyond the mission of your own organization, is to not look at this in terms of punitive, problematic notations that are found in an audit, but saying, okay, these are the challenges that we need to build into the program as it transitions to something else based upon learned experience.
I think we share the same concern, and I think we're sharing the same language. DFC, we want to see that succeed. Any system that is in place, that goes to our top management challenge 4, that has fundamentally flawed systems, such as internal controls, OPIC will be part of the DFC. That needs to be remedied. So that success and that hope that's there for the DFC can be addressed. So these aren't minor issues. These are systemic issues that, quite frankly, are substantial and need to be addressed.
Madam Chair, there's not a member that's gone to visit Africa that doesn't come back and say, China is everywhere. What are we doing? And here is a big part of the answer. Thank you.
Great questions, and thank you for covering that piece. Thank you both for being here. I have spent majority of my life in public service addressing issues of public corruption at many levels, from the local, state, and now at the federal level. And as you both know, there are many layers associated with that, and not all of it includes money exchanges. Some of it, comes in different forms. I'd like to follow up on Chairwoman Lowy's question on your investigation into political retributions. The State Department strongly supported the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, known as CSIG, since it began operations in 2007. However, between 2017 and 2018, the department's policy changed. It is unfortunate. It pushed for reforms to CSIG and did not object when the government of Guatemala took a number of aggressive actions against the commission and its staff. Did you look into what role political appointees at the Bureau of International Organizations, including Mari Stoll, played in changing the department's policy towards CSIG?
No, we haven't looked at that issue. We may have received an inquiry about CSIG some time ago, and I'd have to get back to you, but that particular question we did not look into.
I hope that you will look into it in the future. CSIG is in the process of being completely shut down. It will be at the end of this month. It is not surprising to me that we have so many people from Guatemala fleeing at many different levels. Not only have, department employees worked against improving conditions there that I think have resulted in the number of more migrants fleeing the area in our southern border. So I hope that I can follow up with you, whether it's here, in a private meeting, in a classified briefing, but I think it is something that we need to seriously look at. My other question, as it relates to the lines, blurring the lines of political corruption. I understand that Secretary Pompeo has been traveling quite a bit to the Midwest, including to Kansas. I also understand that he may be considering a run for a Senate seat in Kansas. I am concerned that the Secretary may be using official resources for political purposes, which would not only constitute a possible Hatch Act violation, but also would fall within the Inspector General's mandate to investigate waste, fraud, and abuse. Have you looked into the Secretary's travel to Kansas?
We have not. We'll look into any credible allegations of misconduct, and happy to work with your staff if you have information about that.
If someone is looking to run for a political office and, specifically taking certain trips to boost, their profile within that state, I think that that's something that you ought to be concerned, since this is your area that you oversee. I am a fan of USAID. I've been in the trenches with them throughout the Western Hemisphere. Mm-hmm. I'm very concerned about what is happening with the personnel. They're understaffed, they are stressed, they have very little resources. As it relates to the Northern Triangle, cutting off humanitarian assistance with partners that they have worked with in the region for several years now. I'm very concerned about what will happen to those programs and what that will, how that will continue to impact our crisis at our southern border. So I hope that you will continue to pay special attention to that, and that you will come back to our committee with some real ways that we can address that for the future.
As I mentioned, we have staff in Salvador, and we're both on the audit side and the investigation side of the House. We continue to monitor the programs that are being funded in that region, and particularly concerned about the security aspects of this. And as long as the programs are continuing and up and running, there's always a place for the IG's office. So we are there in full force.
My glass is always half full, and as it relates to El Salvador, they have a new president who seems to really be taking the issues of public corruption there seriously. He seems to want to work with everyone who is able and willing to help him address those issues, the issues of security within the region. I hope that we don't let this opportunity go to waste. I think that if we had been a little bit more willing to assist, Morales might have not gone sideways in Guatemala as he did. So with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Turn to Mr. Rogers, but I just wanted to follow up with Ms. Torres's comment, because it seems to me throughout the course of this hearing, you're doing the reports. The question is, what is the executive branch? What is the Secretary of State doing? Is there any response? Does anyone care? And this is the challenge for all of us. You're doing the reports. We're getting the information. My colleagues mentioned West Bank and Gaza. We see dozens of examples where there aren't people in responsible positions who can make these changes. So I'm going to turn to Mr. Rogers now, but I do hope that we can follow up and make sure that this isn't just a hearing telling us that you're doing your job. But the question is, who are you reporting to and what are they doing about it? Mr. Rogers.
Madam Chair, can I interrupt for a minute and ask for unanimous consent to enter 2 articles to the record that specifically relate to the questions that I was asking?
Thank you, of course. So be it. Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Linick, a recent audit of State Department's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, the office that's responsible for licensed exports of defense items, articles. The audit revealed that the department does not have a standard training program for embassy officers who conduct those end-use checks on U.S. weapons sold abroad. Why would the department charge Foreign Service officers with the responsibility of end-use monitoring, a program to prevent the unauthorized acquisition or use of U.S. military articles and technology, without having required training in that subject prior to a posting overseas?
That's a great question. That particular report, not only wasn't there sufficient training for this end-use monitoring, but we found that as a result of staffing issues at the time, the department lacked certain internal controls to assure that applications that were made for arms contained proper information and accurate information. And they were approved. We looked at 21 applications. 20 of them were approved without the required information of them. We also found, as a result of lack of staffing, that the department wasn't providing certifications to Congress as it's required to for arms exports over $1 million in about 17 export deals. Again, this was really a function of a staffing issue at the time, and I would assess that the reason there wasn't the training was because of a staffing issue. I'm not sure. You'd have to ask the department. But clearly there were some problems. I understand now that they have remediated those concerns and have addressed our recommendations.
Well, security assistance is a substantial enterprise, DOD and state, providing about $18 billion annually, of which $8 billion are State Department funds. DOD, Department of Defense, has started a workforce reform requirements which was mandated in the 2017 Defense Authorization Act. And they continue to build an enhanced school for security cooperation training. State does not have any such place, to my knowledge. Is that correct?
I'm not sure about that. Clearly, if they don't, this might be a good model for state, but I'd have to get back to you on that.
Well, it's important that we protect American military secrets and equipment. And we need people who have training to oversee and watch that practice in the embassies of the countries where these items are to be shipped. Do you agree with that?
I agree.
Madam Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Linick, I want to raise a case that's recently come to light about a State Department intelligence officer who was apparently blocked by the White House from submitting written congressional testimony. On the way to asking you about that, let me just back off and say, to the extent you can kind of translate our discussion today into some specific statistics that would put a finer point on some of the management challenges, I want to request that you do that. Maybe you know some of this off the top of your head. I liked Mr. Rogers' understatement that we have a management shortfall here that we've dealt with for years. Secretary Pompeo took office a little over a year ago. He's made claims to the effect that a lot of this management shortfall is being dealt with, that the appointments, senior appointments are being made, that morale is up, that diplomacy is again being respected. I wonder what kind of specific figures do you have? How many ambassadorships are still unfilled, for example?
I don't have that. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
How many are unconfirmed? How many are not named? Do you have that figure, actually?
I don't. I mean, you'd have to ask the department. I don't know. I don't keep a running tally of that.
Well, I think that's a legitimate request of the IG's office that you could provide that kind of basic baseline information. What about the pace of retirements?
I don't have that information. Again, that's the State Department would have that.
All right. Well, I'm asking you if you could get that information and furnish it to us. The morale is harder to get at, but surveys are taken about morale in one federal department or another, or in all the departments. Do we have information about any kind of measures of morale levels?
Well, we are about to, we're finalizing a report on the hiring freeze, and it does get at that issue. I'm not in a position to sort of report on that now, but I can tell you, based on our inspections at posts, I mean, in terms of the hiring freeze, that did have an impact on morale around the world.
And there are other possible measures that I'm not thinking of, I'm sure. But, Madam Chairman, I think one way or another we need this basic information about the progress we're making or not making on these very serious management challenges. I think we need that for our hearing records. So one way or another, we ask you to help us get that information. Now let me ask you about this extraordinary case. It just comes to light recently in news stories. Ron Schoonover worked in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research Office of the Geographer and Global Issues. Spoke before the House Intelligence Committee on June 5th about the security risks the U.S. would face by virtue of climate change. But now apparently the White House has said that he can't submit the Bureau's written statement that climate impacts could be possibly catastrophic, quote, possibly catastrophic. Now the State Department apparently stood by Mr. Schoonover, but the quashing of his testimony came from three divisions of the White House: Legislative Affairs, Management and Budget, and the National Security Council. In the meantime, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee demanded that the heads of two federal intelligence agencies provide documents about this incident: the Bureau of Intelligence and Research of the Office and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Neither of them have complied. I'm not necessarily asking you to comment on this specific case, but I do want to ask you if this is the sort of case that you would you and your office would attend to. I mean, this isn't just a policy disagreement. This is a quashing of testimony to a congressional committee. How does a case of this sort come before you?
So, I mean, our jurisdiction obviously extends to the Department Programs and Operations, and when we assess whether we're going to do work, obviously we cannot do programmatic or policy work. We don't have oversight over the White House. But what we do is we look to see whether there are any rules, and I don't know, I haven't studied this at all, and this has not come before me. Are there criteria? Are there rules? Are there foreign affairs manual violations? Are there regulations that have been violated? That's sort of how we do our assessment. I can't comment as to these particular facts. You know, whether we would play a role in this depends on the answer to those questions. Sure.
Thank you. I just want to close on what I think is an issue that's been brought up by many of my colleagues, and I know we share a serious concern. Now, of course, this bill has not been through the Senate. We hope one day soon we'll be able to conference. But we have appropriated in our bill $56 billion. That's a lot of money. And I know my colleagues take that responsibility very, very seriously. Mr. Linick, your office has identified that the oversight of foreign assistance funding is a recurring challenge, and noted in both 2015 and 2017 that the State Department's core financial management systems were not designed to track and report on foreign assistance funds. While both state and USAID have improved their financial management systems over the years, accuracy and transparency around how appropriated funding is spent is paramount. And I want to make it very clear. We just can't tolerate waste, fraud, and abuse. It becomes a cliche because we talk about it so much, but we all take this very, very seriously. It's our responsibility. So maybe you can tell me, what improvements has the State Department made to track and improve the management of foreign assistance programs since these reports were issued? Is this a problem a result or representative of any systemic management issues? And can the State Department both track funds at the project and country levels and manage projects effectively? So for me, who've been on this committee for quite a while, I just don't get it. That's your response. Both of you can respond. This is your responsibility. How can you say you can't track the fund? I know it's difficult in many of these countries where wars are going on, you have disease abounds, but it seems to me if we can't keep track, how can I as a chair continue to argue for increased investments in foreign aid? You can take turns.
You make a very good point. We have identified this problem, and they cannot still track by program, project, sector in a management-friendly way, or in a way in which would give them the kind of data to make important decisions about foreign assistance and how unspent funds are used.
Do you accept that?
I think it's unacceptable.
Good.
And we, we've done 2 reports already, and we're going to follow up on this. I mean, they've made modest improvement. We've basically said, look, you need to, one, identify the data that needs to be collected, and they have, but that's only the first step. They need to harness the data, and this is a long, expensive project, so it's not something that can be done overnight. And the second thing is it needs sustained leadership to drive implementation of this. They have designated the F Bureau as the designated sort of bureau to lead this. The problem is there's been an acting, back to your original question, an acting director of F, and there hasn't been a lot of sustained focus on this particular issue. So while there have been improvements, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Well, would you like to comment on it as well?
So I'd be happy to comment on that, and I want to say this goes to the heart of our fourth top management challenge, which is addressing vulnerabilities in financial management and information security. You are right in saying that in the case of USAID has made improvements over time. There is only one material weakness that is left with regard to fund balance reconciliation between the books at USAID and that with Treasury. It may take too long to go into those distinctions about that $235 million that hasn't been able to be reconciled, but we are happy to report that for the amount that can be reconciled, which is slightly over $100 million, they have made tremendous progress in getting that reconciliation figured out, and that amount is down to $60 million now. The problem and why this happened is because of legacy systems. 100 missions around the world, legacy systems, different data dictionaries, different migration tools. They've now adopted a controlled system known as Phoenix to track their financial management, their programming as it goes out. They have new tools in place, which are cash reconciliation tools. So we are hopeful that these kinds of balances or inability to track the funds will be addressed with some of these changes. But I'm here to say we, again, are on that. We do our annual financial statements work every year, and we drill down on the issues there. And there still remains that one material weakness. But from when I started to where we are today, at least we're down to one material weakness. So we will be diligent about overseeing that, to your point and to your concern.
Well, let me just say on behalf of Mr. Rogers and myself, we take our responsibility seriously. We lead this committee because we really care about the work that this committee does. And we are passionate about making sure that this money is spent effectively, as it should be, around the world. And I would like to follow up with you in a month. I'd like to know how improvements have been made. As far as I'm concerned, it's just unacceptable. If I go into a meeting and I'm arguing for $58, $56 billion, that's a lot of money. And I'm not sure how we're going to end up in the Senate. But frankly, it doesn't strengthen our case in helping people who desperately need our help in the world. And to me, that's what the United States of America stands for and is all about. So I hope you can follow up with us. We intend to follow up with you. And as far as I'm concerned, if we can't account for the dollars that are spent, it makes it difficult for us to appropriate. And if all these open positions remain open, then it makes your job even more difficult, because who's doing the work? Who's doing the oversight here or around the world? So thank you again for testifying. This concludes today's hearing. The Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations, and Related Programs stands adjourned. Thank you.